Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, not to a grand castle or a heroic battlefield, but to the most foundational and, frankly, most dreadful part of daily medieval life, dinner. Picture this. You're sitting in your modern kitchen, the fridge humming softly, an array of fresh food just a door away. You could have a salad with greens flown in from another continent, a pizza delivered to your doorstep, or maybe just a bowl of your favorite cereal. The choices are endless. The hygiene is assumed, and the flavor is, for the most part, a given. Now, take a deep, slow breath, because in about 2 minutes, all of that is going to vanish. You're going to find yourself in a dimly lit, smoke-filled hovel, a single iron pot hanging over an open fire, and your meal for the evening is a thick, gray slop of something. It's a meal you'll probably have for the rest of your short, miserable life, and you probably wouldn't survive a week, let alone a year. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a muddy, rutted path, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, wet earth, and something vaguely rancid. The sun is a dull, weak orb, barely piercing the ever-present clouds of the 14th century. Your stomach rumbles, a hollow, expectant sound, but there's no promise of a satisfying meal. There's only the prospect of what awaits you at home, a simple, uninspired, and likely unappetizing bowl of whatever's left. Food in the Middle Ages was not an experience of pleasure. It was an act of survival. A historical fact you'll want to remember is that starvation was a constant, looming threat for the vast majority of the population. A bad harvest could mean widespread famine, not just a slight price increase at the market. Entire villages could be wiped out. And in a time before global supply chains, there was no backup plan. You might think that your survival instincts would kick in, that you'd be foraging for berries or catching a rabbit. And you might, but every choice was a gamble. You'd have to navigate a world without reliable information. Is that mushroom edible, or will it give you a stomach cramp that lasts for days? Is that stream water clean, or will it bring on a bout of the flux that sends you to your eternal rest? There's a quirky tidbit you might find interesting. Medieval doctors often believed that eating too many vegetables, particularly raw ones, caused a person to get sick. The reasoning was, they came from the ground and were therefore cold and wet, upsetting the balance of your humors. Think of it like this. Your parents telling you not to eat cookie dough. Except in this case, it was the actual medical advice of the day, and it applied to almost everything that wasn't boiled to a pulp. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? The food pyramid as we know it would be completely upside down, with grains and boiled meats at the bottom, and fresh produce at the very top, a dangerous, almost mythical entity. Historians still argue whether the lack of fresh fruit and vegetable consumption was a result of genuine medical belief or if it was a convenient rationalization for a practical problem. A lack of efficient food storage and a general distrust of anything that could be carrying unseen filth. Perhaps both. As you shuffle toward the flickering light of your home, you can almost hear the soft, bubbling sound of the cauldron, the promise of warmth and sustenance. But don't get too excited. The contents of that pot are the true start of our story. The culinary journey of a medieval person was one of monotony and risk, where every mouthful was a reminder of their place in the world, and every flavor, or lack thereof, told a story of hardship. So, you're not just heading home for a meal. You're heading home to confront a reality that will make you appreciate your modern refrigerator more than you ever thought possible. As you cross the threshold, the air becomes heavy and warm, thick with the smell of wet wool and the ever-present, starchy scent of simmering grain. Your home, a simple cottage of wattle and daub, is just one room, and the center of your universe is the hearth. Hanging above the crackling fire is the cast iron pot, the one you'll come to know intimately over the course of your life. And what's inside? Well, it's not a secret. It's the same thing it was yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. It's a thick, gray porridge known as pottage, and its primary ingredient is grain. Now, don't picture a quaint bowl of oatmeal with a few berries on top. This is a coarse, unrefined, and frankly dangerous concoction, the bedrock of the medieval diet. for almost everyone, was grain. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats formed the vast majority of calories consumed. A mainstream historical fact to chew on is that an average peasant would eat 2 to 3 pounds of bread a day. That's not a typo. Pounds. That's a staggering amount, and it tells you everything you need to know about where your nutrition was coming from. It wasn't a diverse mix of foods, it was a monotonous carbohydrate parade. This reliance on grain, however, had its own set of problems. The milling process was rudimentary. Stones ground the grain, but not very well. This meant that the flour was full of bits of grit and stone. Imagine biting into a sandwich. But every third bite you get a little crunch. That crunch wasn't a happy accident, it was a guarantee. Over a lifetime of eating this kind of bread, your teeth would be ground down, worn away by the constant abrasion. You'd be lucky to have a full set of teeth by the time you reached your 40s. A quirky tidbit about this is that archaeologists studying medieval skeletons can often determine a person's social status by the state of their teeth. The peasants, with their gritty bread, had worn-down teeth, while the nobility, who could afford whiter, more finely sifted flour, had much healthier chompers. Your dental plan in the Middle Ages was, hope you don't need teeth later. The dangers didn't stop there. The grain itself was often contaminated. The fields were filled with weeds. And one of the most insidious was ergot. This fungus, which grows on rye and other grains, is a source of powerful psychoactive compounds. Eating bread made from contaminated rye could lead to a terrifying condition known as St. Anthony's fire, or ergotism. Symptoms included painful burning sensations in the limbs, convulsions, and hallucinations. It's not a fun party drug, it's a slow, agonizing poison. You'd be writhing in pain, seeing things, and thinking you were possessed by demons. And of course, the people around you would likely agree. Historians still argue whether some of the mass hysteria and seemingly supernatural events of the period, like the dancing plagues, were actually outbreaks of ergotism. It's hard to separate the medical from the mystical when both are so terrifyingly intertwined. The sheer volume of grain you had to consume also meant that your diet was incredibly imbalanced. There was a lack of essential vitamins and nutrients that modern medicine has taught us are critical for health. Think about it. A diet of almost nothing but bread and pottage would leave you deficient in everything from vitamin C to iron. You'd be lethargic, prone to illness, and a whole lot less than you are right now. The constant struggle for calories meant that variety was a luxury, and survival was the only goal. As you dip your wooden spoon into the pottage, you realize this isn't just a meal. It's a testament to a life of hardship. A slow, grinding process that wears you down, inside and out, one gritty, starchy bite at a time. The simple act of eating becomes a reminder of your place in a world where sustenance is a battle, and flavor is a myth. With your belly full of gritty pottage, you might start to crave something more substantial, something with a bit of bite. And in your mind, that's meat. But here, in this smoky, low-ceilinged hut, the idea of a juicy steak is a complete fantasy. The relationship with meat in the medieval world was complicated. It wasn't a food group you just went to the local supermarket to pick up. For most people, it was a rare and precious commodity, a symbol of either a successful hunt or an especially good harvest. A mainstream historical fact you need to understand is that the vast majority of meat consumed by the common folk was pork. Pigs were the ideal livestock for a peasant family. They could forage for their own food in the forests, eating acorns and other scraps, and they grew quickly. A cow, on the other hand, was a long-term investment. They provided milk and were used for labor. But killing one was like selling the family car for a one-time feast. So, if you were lucky enough to have meat, it was probably pork, but it wasn't the bacon and sausage you're imagining. Preserving meat was a massive challenge. Remember, there's no refrigeration. The main methods were salting, smoking, or drying. You can imagine what this did to the flavor and texture. Salting involved packing the meat in immense quantities of salt, which drew out the moisture and made it incredibly tough and, well, salty. You'd then have to soak it for a long time before cooking, which often just made it soggy and still very salty. Smoking involved hanging the meat over a fire, which infused it with a strong, smoky flavor that masked almost anything else. So, even if you got a piece of meat, it was a far cry from what you're used to. It was a dense, salty, chewy block of sustenance, not a tender, flavorful cut. This leads us to a quirky tidbit about medieval butchery. Because refrigeration was non-existent, the butchers would often sell meat from the animal as quickly as possible. This led to a surprising use of offal, the internal organs and less desirable parts. Everything from the liver and kidneys to the heart and even the brains were used in stews and pies. It was a waste not, want not approach born of necessity. You might find a recipe for a pie made with a pig's head, or a stew where the main ingredient was a cow's stomach. It was a practical solution to a massive problem. But it definitely adds a layer of rustic charm, doesn't it? Or maybe it just sounds kind of gross. There's another factor, and it's a big one: the availability of game. Hunting was often strictly controlled. The forests were the property of the lord, and poaching was a serious crime, punishable by brutal fines or even death. This meant that the wild animals you might think of as a food source, deer, boars, rabbits, were mostly off limits to you. You weren't a rugged hunter-gatherer. You were a tenant farmer whose food options were dictated by a man who lived in a stone castle on a hill. Historians still argue whether these poaching laws were primarily about protecting the lord's food source or a way to assert and enforce his absolute control over the land and its people. It was probably a little bit of both. A delicious, for him, combination of power and protein. So, as you stare at your pottage, remember that the only reason a small piece of preserved pork might be in there is because someone worked tirelessly to ensure it didn't spoil. And even then, its flavor and texture were probably a huge letdown. The simple act of eating meat in the Middle Ages was a reminder of your place in a rigid social hierarchy. A chewable lesson in the stark realities of survival. And a taste of salt you'd never forget. After a meal of pottage and a piece of salty pork, your body might start to crave something fresh. Something green, something that hasn't been boiled into a colorless mush. You'd think that the fields and forests around you would be a source of an abundance of fresh fruits and vegetables. But in the medieval mind, and for practical reasons, they were a source of suspicion and even fear. A mainstream historical fact that is hard for us to grasp is that raw fruits and vegetables were considered unhealthy and dangerous by many, especially those who could afford to be picky. Peasants might eat what they could grow, but the elite often avoided them. The prevailing medical theory of the day was the theory of the four humors, which posited that the body was made up of four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A person was healthy when these were in balance. Foods were also categorized by their humor qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Most vegetables were considered cold and wet, and therefore, eating them raw could throw your body out of balance and make you sick. A doctor might even prescribe cooked, dry foods to a sick person to restore their balance. It's a bit like a medieval version of, don't eat ice cream when you have a cold, but applied to everything green. This intellectual distrust was compounded by a very real, very practical problem: hygiene. Or, more accurately, the complete lack of it. A quirky tidbit is that you had no concept of modern food safety. Vegetables were grown in fields fertilized with manure, which could contain dangerous bacteria. They were then transported and handled without being washed in clean water, which, as you remember, wasn't a given. The thought of eating something straight out of the field, unboiled and unpurified by fire, was a terrifying proposition. It was a gamble you likely couldn't afford to take. Better to cook everything to death, just to be sure. So, even if you did get your hands on some carrots, they would be boiled in your pottage until they were unrecognizable and flavorless. The variety of available produce was also incredibly limited compared to today. Remember that vibrant supermarket produce aisle? Gone. You were restricted to what could be grown locally and what was in season. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips were common, as were cabbage and onions, because they could be stored through the winter. Fruits were often seen as a treat, and they were most often cooked down into sauces or pies, or dried, to make them last. Apples, pears, plums, and cherries were available, but in season, and they weren't the perfectly round, unblemished varieties you see today. They were often small, gnarled, and full of blemishes. They were also not something you'd eat raw, a fate often reserved for the wealthy. Who could afford to indulge in such a frivolous, and potentially dangerous, act? Historians still argue whether the lack of fruit and vegetable consumption was a key factor in the poor health and short lifespans of the medieval period. Was it the direct result of the lack of vitamins and minerals? Or was it just one of many factors, including sanitation, poor medical knowledge, and the constant threat of famine? It's hard to say for sure, but the results are clear. Your body, deprived of essential nutrients, would be weaker, more susceptible to disease, and would age faster. As you look at the dull, boiled pottage in your bowl, you realize that the most vibrant colors on your plate are probably a figment of your modern imagination. The verdant greens and bright reds of a healthy diet were, for most, a luxury they couldn't afford, a danger they wouldn't risk, and a culinary concept they didn't even understand. With your meal of flavorless, gritty pottage and salty pork behind you, you're left with a question. What could possibly make this food palatable? The answer, for those who could afford it, was spice. In our modern world, spices are an afterthought, a quick dash from a jar in your cupboard. In the medieval world, they were a luxury, a status symbol, and a crucial tool for a very specific culinary problem. A mainstream historical fact you might find surprising is just how expensive spices were. They were literally worth their weight in gold. Peppercorns, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger were all traded along complex and dangerous routes from Asia to Europe. This long and perilous journey made them incredibly rare and costly. If you were a wealthy lord or a powerful merchant, your ability to have a heavily spiced dish was a massive flex. A clear signal that you were part of the elite. To be served a dish with a generous dusting of pepper was a way of saying, I am so wealthy, I can afford to throw away money on something that has no nutritional value. But it wasn't just about showing off. Spices had a practical application. A quirky tidbit is that spices were often used to mask the taste of spoilage. Remember that salty, tough piece of meat from the last section? Well, after a few days of sitting around, it would start to go a bit off. A heavy dose of black pepper or a sprinkling of cloves could help to cover up the taste of meat that was no longer fresh. It wasn't about making the food taste good, it was about making it taste like something other than old. The rich didn't eat spoiled food, but their food was still a gamble. And the spices were their insurance. And while we're on the subject, a surprising fact is that medieval cooks were also not above using copious amounts of sugar, which was another expensive import. To make dishes palatable, the noble diet was, in a lot of ways, a combination of extremes, salty, sweet, and heavily spiced, all to hide a fundamental lack of freshness. The spice trade was so important that it shaped global events. It was a key driver for the age of exploration, as European powers sought to find direct sea routes to the sources of these valuable commodities. Bypassing the expensive middlemen of the Middle East, historians still argue whether the demand for spices was the single most important economic driver of the era. The quest for spices certainly motivated great voyages, but so did the search for gold and new trade routes. It's hard to untangle one thread from the other when they were all woven into the grand tapestry of global expansion. So, as you imagine the bland, starchy food of the common person, remember that another world existed just a few social rungs above. A world of powerful, aromatic, and exciting flavors. But even there, the joy of food was tied to its cost and its ability to cover up the imperfections of a world without refrigeration. The spice on a noble's plate was not just a culinary ingredient, it was a testament to a world of vast inequalities. A delicious-smelling veil over the simple, but brutal, reality that freshness was a luxury, and flavor was a privilege. As you've seen, your food options are incredibly limited. But remember, this is your peasant's plate we're talking about. Just a short walk away, up on the hill, lies the castle of the Lord, where the food is an entirely different world. A world that perfectly illustrates the vast social chasm of the time. A mainstream historical fact you need to understand is that social class dictated diet with an almost ironclad rigidity. For you, a peasant, life revolved around a diet of coarse grain, maybe some legumes, and if you were lucky, a small amount of salted pork or offal. The staple was pottage, a thick porridge or stew made from whatever was on hand, oats, peas, cabbage, and roots. It was a monotonous, nutrient-poor, but calorie-dense meal designed for survival and for the kind of back-breaking labor you'd be doing all day. A peasant's life was one of repetition, and their food was no different. The variety, as you've seen, was non-existent, and the flavors were earthy, starchy, and often bland. Now, let's imagine we get a peek into the castle kitchen. The menu for a lord was almost a direct inversion of yours. Meat was a primary source of sustenance. And not just salty pork. The lord and his court dined on an impressive array of freshly roasted meats, venison, wild boar, hare, and various types of fowl like peacocks, swans, and geese. A quirky tidbit is that peacocks were a popular centerpiece for banquets. They were often skinned, roasted, and then redressed in their feathers to appear alive at the feast. A stunning visual spectacle that was more about status than sustenance. Imagine that. A beautiful bird, cooked, then put back in its own skin and feathers to be paraded around the table. It was the ultimate display of conspicuous consumption. A clear message that the host had so much wealth, they could afford to waste a perfectly good animal just for the sake of a grand presentation. The vegetables and fruits in the castle were also different. While still often cooked, they were more varied and sometimes served in elaborate sauces. The nobles had access to orchards and kitchen gardens with a wider range of produce. Their food wasn't just boiled, it was often spiced, sweetened, and colored with rare and expensive ingredients. Think of a rich meat stew flavored with saffron and ginger. A far cry from your simple pottage. This stark contrast highlights a major scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the difference in diet was a key factor in the physical differences between the social classes. The nobility were generally taller and lived longer than the peasants. Was this because of their superior diet? Or was it a combination of factors, including less strenuous labor, better shelter, and more access to limited medical care? It's a chicken and egg question where the chicken is a perfectly roasted swan and the egg is a coarse, gritty barley loaf. So, as you trudge back to your humble cottage, you can almost smell the roasting meat wafting down from the castle. The food on the hill wasn't just different, it was a symbol of a different kind of life. A life of luxury, of variety, of flavor, and of power. The distance between your pottage and the lord's peacock was more than just a few hundred yards. It was a vast, impassable social chasm, a chasm that you could taste with every bland, starchy bite. You've now had a meal. But what are you going to wash it down with? The answer is not a refreshing glass of water. In the Middle Ages, the liquid you drank was as much of a risk as the food you ate. A mainstream historical fact you need to understand is that water was considered unsafe to drink. The sources of water, rivers, wells, and streams, were often contaminated by human and animal waste. The idea of sanitation as we know it didn't exist, and the link between contaminated water and disease wasn't understood. So, to avoid the risk of dysentery, cholera, or any number of other waterborne illnesses, people turned to beverages that had been purified by the process of fermentation. This brings us to ale and mead. For you, the common person, ale was your go-to. It was a low-alcohol beverage made from fermented grain, and it was a staple of your diet. People drank it all day, from breakfast to dinner. You might even give it to your children. And for good reason. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, killed most of the harmful bacteria. A quirky tidbit is that ale was often so low in alcohol content, around 2%, that it was more a liquid food than an intoxicating drink. It provided calories and was safer than what was coming out of the well. So, your constant state of being, a bit tipsy, was actually a state of being, alive. And for the nobility, mead, a fermented honey drink, was a more prized and stronger alternative. Another indicator of their elevated status. But let's be clear, this wasn't a world of happy, drunken revelry. The constant consumption of low-quality ale also had its downsides. The nutritional value was minimal, and the grains used were, as you know, coarse and full of grit. It was a monotonous, daily ritual of survival. You wouldn't be going for a crisp lager, you'd be getting a cloudy, often sour, and sometimes chunky brew. There is a scholarly debate about the medieval drinking habits that still rages on. Historians still argue whether the high consumption of ale truly made people less inebriated than we imagine today. Was the low alcohol content balanced out by the sheer volume of liquid consumed? And what about the quality control, or lack thereof? The fermentation process was not always perfect. And a bad batch could lead to its own set of problems. It's hard to imagine, but a bad drink wasn't just a flavor issue, it was a potential health crisis. So, as you reach for your wooden tankard, remember that you're not just having a drink, you're performing a crucial act of self-preservation. The liquid you're about to consume is a cloudy, yeasty concoction, but it's your best bet at not getting sick. It's a testament to a world where even the most basic necessity, something as simple as a drink of water, was fraught with danger. Your choice wasn't between water and soda, or wine and beer. It was between a brew of questionable quality and a potentially fatal swig from the local river. The fact that you'd choose the brew every time says everything you need to know about why food and drink sucked in the Middle Ages. We've now covered the peasant's plate. But what about the kind of feast we imagine when we think of medieval times? The grand banquet. This was a spectacle, an event meant to impress and display wealth and power. You might think it was a delicious experience, but it was, in reality, a feast for the senses, but not always the stomach. A mainstream historical fact about these banquets is that they were less about taste and more about spectacle. The dishes were often incredibly elaborate and visually stunning. There were sugar sculptures, giant pies filled with live birds, a horrifying, quirky tidbit, and roasted animals reassembled with their feathers or fur back on. As you remember, imagine a boar's head on a platter, its mouth stuffed with an apple. These dishes, known as subtleties, were not meant to be eaten. They were works of art, meant to be admired and then carried away. The food that you actually ate was often the most unappetizing part of the whole affair. The banquets were a chaotic, noisy, and often unsanitary affair. There were no forks, you ate with your hands, and knives were often shared. You'd be lucky if you had a napkin, and even then, it was likely a communal towel. The tables, which were often just planks of wood on trestles, were not very clean, and remember that the food would have been sitting out for hours. Often in a hot, crowded hall, the combination of no refrigeration, communal eating, and an absence of sanitation meant that these feasts, while visually impressive, were also a breeding ground for germs. The flow of the meal was also quite different. Instead of a carefully curated progression of courses, dishes were often served all at once, in a disorganized manner. A quirky tidbit about this is the order of the meal. The medieval medical belief was that certain foods were easier to digest than others. So, you might start with sweet dishes to open your stomach, move to rich meats, and then finish with fruits to seal it. It's a completely opposite order from a modern meal, where you'd have dessert last. This was a culinary philosophy based on a medical theory that we now know to be entirely wrong. But it dictated the entire structure of the feast. Historians still argue whether the purpose of these banquets was primarily political or culinary. Were they a way to forge alliances and impress visiting dignitaries with a display of wealth? Or were they genuinely a moment of culinary exploration and enjoyment for the elite? It was likely a bit of both. The food was a tool, a means to an end, and that end was power. The more outlandish the dish, the more secure the lord felt in his position. So, as you watch the feast unfold in your mind's eye, don't get too hungry. While the sights might be incredible, the gleaming silver platters, the roasted swan, the towering sugar sculptures, the reality is a messy, unhygienic affair where the most impressive dishes are inedible and the food you do eat is tough, overcooked, and full of hidden bacteria. The medieval feast was a triumph of showmanship, but a failure of gastronomy. A perfect example of why even the best food of the era was not a treat for the body, but a spectacle for the eyes. As you've seen, the medieval meal, from the peasant's pottage to the lord's peacock, was fraught with issues. But beneath the grittiness of the grain and the spectacle of the feast lies a more fundamental problem: the utter lack of hygiene. This wasn't a world of clean counters, sanitized hands, and refrigerated food. It was a world where a clean kitchen was an oxymoron, and the consequences were often fatal. A mainstream historical fact you need to understand is that foodborne illness was a constant and expected part of life. There was no concept of germs or bacteria. The very idea that tiny, invisible creatures could make you sick was completely unknown. So, the practices that led to contamination were simply a part of the daily routine. The kitchens were often crowded, smoky places with no running water. The animals were slaughtered on site, and their waste was often just thrown out the door. Imagine a butcher's shop with no refrigeration, and the flies are everywhere. That's your daily reality. The handling of food was also incredibly unhygienic. A quirky tidbit is that medieval cooks and servers often had to wear a coif, a close-fitting cap, but it was more to keep their hair out of the food than to protect the food from them. Hand washing was not a regular practice, and cross-contamination was rampant. The same knife used to cut raw meat might then be used to slice bread. The food, once prepared, would often sit out for hours before being served, especially at a banquet, where it was part of a larger, long event. This provided the perfect conditions for bacteria to multiply. You could get sick from any part of the process, from the contaminated produce to the improperly stored meat. This brings us to a major scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the numerous epidemics of the Middle Ages, from the various plagues to the more localized outbreaks of fever and dysentery, were primarily caused by food and water contamination. The Black Death, for instance, is often attributed to fleas on rats, but the poor nutrition and constant exposure to foodborne illness likely weakened the population, making them more susceptible to disease. It's hard to separate the cause and effect when the entire system was so precarious. So, as you watch the cook stirring the cauldron in your little hovel, or the grand chef in the castle kitchen, you're not just seeing the preparation of a meal. You're seeing a high-stakes gamble. The food you're about to eat, whether a simple pottage or a roasted swan, has passed through unwashed hands and sat in an unsanitary environment. The taste of your meal is not just a taste of what's on the plate. It's a taste of a world where a stomach ache could be a death sentence. And the simple act of eating was a daily dance with disease. The lack of basic hygiene was not just an inconvenience, it was a fundamental flaw in the medieval food system. And it's a major reason why food sucked. Your diet is monotonous, the food is often gritty, and the hygiene is non-existent. But there's another powerful force dictating what you can and can't eat: the Church. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a central authority that influenced every aspect of your life, including your plate. A mainstream historical fact you might not know is that religious fasting was a constant and significant part of the medieval calendar. You weren't just fasting for Lent. The Church mandated abstinence from meat on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, as well as during Advent and Lent. In total, a pious person could spend up to half the year on a fasting diet. Now, this didn't mean you starved yourself. It meant you abstained from the flesh of animals that walked on land. So, you might switch from your salted pork to fish. And for the common person, this could be a major challenge. If you lived far from a coast or a river, your options were limited, and you'd have to rely on preserved fish, which was often just as unappetizing as the salted meat. This practice led to a quirky tidbit about what was considered fish. Because the rules were based on the idea of flesh, some animals that lived in the water, but weren't exactly fish, were deemed acceptable for fasting days. Beavers, for example, were considered fish for the purpose of fasting because they lived in the water. So, a medieval monk might be dining on beaver while you're picking at some old, dried-out herring. This was a classic example of bending the rules to fit a cultural and culinary need, all under the guise of piety. The Church's influence on food extended beyond just fasting. It also shaped the very structure of the meal, especially for the elite. Monks and priests often had a more varied diet than the average peasant because they were exempt from certain labor and had access to their own lands and gardens. Historians still argue whether the Church's strict dietary rules, particularly the fasting from meat, had a positive or negative impact on public health. On one hand, it may have encouraged a more balanced diet for a short time by forcing people to seek out different sources of protein. On the other hand, it placed an enormous burden on a population that was already on the verge of malnutrition, forcing them to survive on even less. The fact that many of the sick and elderly were given special dispensation from these rules suggests that the Church itself was aware of their potential health impact. So, as you pick the last bit of food from your bowl, remember that even your plate wasn't your own. It was a battleground of need and faith, of tradition and survival. The Church, with its rules and rituals, added yet another layer of restriction to an already restrictive world. It was a world where even your meal was an act of obedience. And a simple bowl of pottage could be a moral and spiritual test. With your stomach now full of pottage and your mind swimming with the rules of the church, let's turn our attention to the how. How is any of this food, however unappealing, actually prepared? The answer is with a lot of fire, a little bit of ingenuity, and very limited tools. A mainstream historical fact is that the primary method of cooking was over an open fire in a hearth. This was the heart of the home, literally and figuratively. Your single pot, as you've come to know, hung over the flames, where it would be used for boiling everything from your pottage to your salted meat. Roasting was a luxury, usually reserved for the nobility who could afford a spit and the space to turn a whole animal over a fire. For you, the peasant, everything was a stew or a boiled mash. It was the most efficient way to cook, but it also resulted in a world of mushy, flavorless food. The lack of temperature control meant that you were either boiling something to death or not cooking it enough. There was no sear or sauté, there was only boil. This brings us to a quirky tidbit about medieval kitchens. They were often communal spaces. For a peasant family, the hearth was in the middle of their one-room house. But even for the wealthy, the kitchen was a separate building from the main hall due to the risk of fire. It was a bustling, chaotic place with a small team of cooks and their assistants. Imagine a modern kitchen without any of the appliances, without a thermostat, and with only a few large iron pots and a couple of knives. The tools of the trade were simple: a knife, a spoon, a few bowls, and of course, the ever-present cauldron. There were no whisks, no measuring cups, and no recipe books with precise instructions. Recipes were passed down orally and were more like rough guidelines than a set of rules. A recipe might say, add a handful of oats, or boil for a long time. Historians still argue whether the lack of advanced cooking methods and tools was a primary cause of the monotonous and uninspired food. Was the limited technology a reflection of a society that valued survival over pleasure? Or was it a driving force that kept the cuisine simple and unadventurous? The answer is likely both. The technology of the time dictated what was possible. And what was possible was a culinary experience that was largely about filling your stomach with calories, not delighting your palate with complex flavors and textures. The art of cooking was less about technique and more about making do with what you had. So, as you watch the flames dance in the hearth, you realize that the simplicity of your food is a direct result of the simplicity of your tools. There's no magic oven, no stovetop with a temperature dial, and no gourmet knife set. There's just a fire, a pot, and a lot of patience. The lack of culinary tools wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a fundamental barrier to a more enjoyable diet. And it's yet another reason why food in the Middle Ages sucked. You have a bowl, a spoon, and a simmering pot over the fire. But where did the contents of that pot come from? In the medieval world, sourcing your supper wasn't as simple as a trip to the local market. It was a perilous journey, a daily struggle that often meant the difference between eating and going hungry. A mainstream historical fact is that for you, the peasant, your food came from one of three places: the fields you farmed, the scraps you could find, or the generosity, or more likely, obligation, of your lord. Your farming was not just for sustenance, it was also for taxes. A significant portion of your harvest would go directly to the lord of the manor, leaving you with just enough to scrape by. You didn't own the land, you were tied to it, and its yield was the very measure of your existence. This constant pressure to produce food for someone else meant that you were always just one bad harvest away from a real crisis. This leads us to a quirky tidbit about the art of foraging. Because a peasant's diet was so reliant on what they could find, they became incredibly knowledgeable about the local environment. They knew which wild plants were edible, which mushrooms were not, and where to find certain berries or nuts. This was a skill passed down from generation to generation, a kind of unwritten survival guide. But it was also a gamble. A mistake could lead to a painful illness or worse. It was a trade-off, a small amount of extra food for a big risk. You might try to snare a small rabbit or squirrel, but this was a risky business. Remember that hunting was often illegal for the common person, and a caught poacher faced serious punishment. This constant struggle for food was one of the defining features of life. A bad winter or a summer drought wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a life-threatening event. Historians still argue whether the consistent threat of famine was a key factor in keeping the population under control. The lords didn't need a standing army to keep the peasants in check. The specter of starvation was enough to ensure they stayed on the land and followed the rules. The food supply was not just a matter of economics, it was a tool of social and political control. It was a delicious, if dangerous, weapon. So, as you imagine walking through the fields and forests, you're not just taking a pleasant stroll. You're on a mission, a high-stakes scavenger hunt with your very life on the line. The food you gather is a testament to your hard work, your knowledge, and your luck. The simple act of putting food on the table was a daily reminder that you were a small part of a much larger, more brutal system, and that your survival was always dependent on forces far beyond your control. As you prepare to eat your meal, you probably don't think about how it will affect your health in a deeper sense. You know it will provide calories. But what about its medicinal properties? In the medieval world, food and medicine were deeply intertwined. The belief was that what you ate could not only make you sick, but also cure you. A mainstream historical fact you need to grasp is that this was all based on the theory of the four humors, which you'll remember from earlier. This ancient Greek theory, revived and adapted in the Middle Ages, taught that the human body was a microcosm of the universe, and its health was governed by the balance of four humors: blood, hot and wet; phlegm, cold and wet; yellow bile, hot and dry; and black bile, cold and dry. Every food and plant was also categorized by these qualities. For a doctor, or a wise woman, the key to treating a sickness was to restore the balance of the humors. If you had a fever, which was considered hot, you would be given cold foods, like cucumbers or melon, to cool you down. If you were lethargic, a cold condition, you might be prescribed spicy, hot foods to warm you up. This led to some quirky dietary prescriptions. A quirky tidbit is that medieval medical texts often recommended eating specific animals for specific ailments. For example, the meat of a hare was believed to cure melancholy, a cold condition, because the hare was known to be a lively, fast-moving animal. Similarly, the blood of a wild boar was sometimes used to treat fevers because it was seen as hot and could fight fire with fire. These beliefs sound strange to us, but they were the medical consensus of the day. A blend of folk wisdom and pseudoscience. Historians still argue whether this humoral theory was a helpful or harmful approach to medicine. While it seems bizarre to us, it did encourage a certain kind of holistic thinking about the body and the environment. It also led people to seek out a variety of foods and herbs. Even if the reasons were wrong, was it just a superstition? Or was there a grain of truth in some of the remedies? It's hard to know for sure. But the reality is that a doctor's prescription for a common cold might have been a bowl of chicken broth and some bitter herbs, which, as we now know, might actually have helped. So, as you stare at your pottage, you're not just seeing a meal, you're seeing a medical intervention, a balance of humors, a remedy for whatever ails you. Food was a tool, a drug, a prescription, and a source of both health and disease. And in a world without modern medicine, this was the best you had. The simple act of eating was not just about survival, it was a daily attempt to keep your fragile, humoral balance in check. You've now spent a good amount of time with the foods of medieval Europe, and you're probably wondering if anything new ever showed up. The world wasn't completely static, and while your diet was incredibly monotonous, there were tiny, slow changes on the horizon. A mainstream historical fact you need to understand is that the arrival of new foods from beyond Europe was incredibly slow and limited. Before the age of exploration in the 15th century, the flow of new ingredients was a trickle, not a flood. The primary route for exotic goods was the Silk Road, which brought a few, extremely valuable items from Asia. Spices, of course, were the most important of these, as you remember from our earlier discussion, but there were a few other things that made their way to Europe, though they would have been so rare you'd never see them. Things like rice, sugar, and lemons began to appear in the kitchens of the wealthy, but only as a rare luxury. They were not part of the common person's diet. Imagine a world where sugar was kept in a locked box, or where a single lemon was a diplomatic gift. This leads us to a quirky tidbit about some of the earliest, new, ingredients. Take lemons, for example. They first appeared in Europe in the 1st century AD, but their use was limited. and they were seen more as a medicine than a food. They were considered a hot food and were often prescribed to people with cold ailments. For you, the peasant, a lemon was something you'd probably never see. But for the wealthy, it was a status symbol, a rare and expensive import that spoke of their global connections and wealth. Their very presence was a sign of a new kind of world, even if it was a world you couldn't access. Historians still argue whether the slow introduction of new foods was a result of a lack of demand or a reflection of the difficulty of long-distance trade. Were the Europeans simply not interested in new things? Or were the trade routes too dangerous and expensive to support a regular flow of exotic goods? The truth is likely a combination of both. The medieval palate was a local palate, used to local flavors and local risks. The idea of embracing new and unknown foods was a foreign concept, literally and figuratively. So, as you finish your meal, remember that while you were eating the same old pottage, a few very wealthy people were getting their first taste of something new. But their experience was so far removed from yours that it was a different world entirely. The arrival of new foods wasn't a revolution, it was a quiet, almost imperceptible change that would take centuries to reach your plate. The culinary world was a fortress, and new ingredients were not a welcome change, but a rare and expensive visitor. We've reached the end of our journey, and you're back in your one-room hovel. The fire is slowly dying down, and a gentle breeze pushes a wisp of smoke out through the hole in the roof. The light is dim, and the air is heavy with the smell of wet earth and ancient wood smoke. And there, on your small wooden table, is your meal. It's a simple bowl of pottage, still steaming, still gray, still the same meal you had yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. Let's take a final look at everything on your plate, or in your bowl. To be precise, you've got that thick, starchy pottage. You now know it's full of coarse grain, maybe barley or oats, with bits of grit and chaff mixed in. It's a meal that's slowly, surely, grinding down your teeth. A mainstream historical fact to remember is that you'd be lucky if it contained a few sad, unrecognizable vegetables, boiled to a mushy pulp to kill off any lurking bacteria. Your body, deprived of fresh produce, would be on a slow march toward malnutrition. And in that pottage, if you're particularly lucky, you might find a small chunk of salted pork. It's tough, chewy, and so salty it makes you wince. But it's a calorie-dense lifeline. It's a taste of the pig that you helped raise. A pig that was also your family's savings account. That meat wasn't a treat, it was a necessary source of protein. And its flavor was a testament to the brutal realities of a world without refrigeration. A quirky tidbit is that you would have no sense of a balanced plate. The modern idea of a meal with a main course, a side dish, and a vegetable would be completely alien. Your meal is a single, thick, calorie-focused mush designed for one purpose, survival. You reach for your cup. The water from the well is too risky, so you opt for the cloudy, low-alcohol ale, which you know has been boiled to a safe, if unappetizing, state. The drink is less about pleasure and more about hydration without the threat of death. It's a reminder that even the most basic necessities of life were fraught with danger. You're not having a nightcap, you're just not dying. Historians still argue whether the medieval diet, in all its simplicity and monotony, was a key factor in the short lifespans of the time. Was it the direct cause of death? Or was it just one of many culprits, including a lack of hygiene, poor sanitation, and constant warfare? The answers are complicated and intertwined. But one thing is clear. The food you've just eaten, the same one you've eaten 1,000 times before, was a source of stress, not joy. It was a daily reminder of your place in a world that was hard, unyielding, and often very, very boring. The medieval meal was a triumph of endurance, a testament to a life lived on the edge, where every bite was a gamble and every meal was a routine. Now, that's where our story ends for tonight. The journey through the dismal culinary landscape of the Middle Ages is complete. I want you to take a moment and think about the humming of your refrigerator, the crisp crunch of a fresh apple, or the simple joy of an ice-cold glass of water. Think about the variety, the safety, the sheer abundance that we take for granted. Let your mind drift from the smoke-filled hut, from the gritty pottage, and from the ever-present gnawing fear of famine. The cold air of the medieval night is beginning to set in. But you are safe, warm, and well-fed. The past is a dark, uncomfortable place, A story we can visit and then leave behind. The smells of old salt and boiling grain are fading now, replaced by the soft sounds of your own peaceful room. You are comfortable, you are secure, and you are tired. There are no more long, hungry nights to endure. Only sleep. The story is over. The work is done, and the world is quiet. Let your mind go dark. Sweet dreams.